Welcome to Sorghum Smart Talk. I'm John Duff, NSP Strategic Business Director, coming to you from Lubbock, Texas. It's not snowing here yet, but it is definitely getting cold in other parts of the country. Hope all our producers are able to get their crop out of the field because it is a really good one. I am joined today by Florentino Lopez. It's a distinct pleasure to call Florentino my boss. He's one of the two guys that I report directly to here at NSP and Sorghum Checkoff. And he's got an interesting background. He has done a lot of cool work that makes him a really good addition to Team Sorghum. And he has been here nearly since the beginning of the Checkoff. So he's got some great perspective on the Checkoff, what we do here, and the industry overall. Florentino, welcome.
Thanks, John. It's great to be here.
Well,
I know it's always difficult when we get together like this and have a discussion, but hopefully this goes well.
It is. So it's pretty early here. I've got to get here really early to beat you here to the office. Your average entry into the office is 4:47-ish. So you come in pretty early and stay pretty late. So tell me about your background. You've done some really cool things. You came from the swine industry, and you've done a tremendous amount there, and it's taken you internationally, and you've done a lot of cool things that give you great perspective. So tell me about that.
It's kind of interesting, John. You know, growing up in South Texas, I never would have assumed that I would have really done all of the things that I've done so far in my lifetime. It's incredible. I mean, as I sit back and I look at coming from South Texas, looking at it overall, and then all of a sudden venturing off into the swine industry, it was something that I really had a deep pleasure, really enjoyed it. I had an opportunity to start work with DeKalb Swine Breeders at the time. DeKalb Swine Breeders was an international company. It was really dedicated to producing breeding stock for facilities and really starting that whole thing of consolidating not only the industry but also swine genetics as a whole. So it was an interesting time to work with them and really spread genetics throughout the world. I had the pleasure of really working in the service industry for quite some time along with DeKalb. So it was one of those things that I had an opportunity to visit many different countries on the swine side. From that, really, I started to work with another company, Texas Farm in Perryton, Texas. Texas Farm, of course, was an international company as well. Its background was in Japan, and so its background really was focused on trying to produce premium pork, not only for the domestic market here in the U.S., but also choice cuts that were being sent to Japan. So there was a lot of things that had to take place to do that, not necessarily only looking at the genetic background, but really trying to piece that together with a program that would really kind of influence the consumer to want to utilize that pork versus other pork. And so it was one of those things that we quickly learned that not only having a traceability program, but having a program that was really defined in marketing was extremely critical. So again, it just kind of offered a lot of background in doing many things in agriculture. Of course, my background growing up was in agriculture as well. So it was a wonderful time to kind of share in that.
So I want to talk more about the consumer angle, because we talk a lot about this here at the Checkoff and NSP, and working with consumers and working with the end user and really telling the story of agriculture. We talk about that a lot. But you said one thing I want to back up on. You said DeKalb Swine Breeders. Elaborate on that a little bit. I know most folks, they hear DeKalb and they probably just assumed that it was the same name and that there was no connection there. But explain a little more about DeKalb and exactly who you worked for and what they used to do.
DeKalb Swine Breeders was part of DeKalb. So if you look at DeKalb International, not only the pork side, but also the poultry side, they used to also have a poultry genetic company. And so along with the seed company that was kind of brought in, those other facets were brought into that company. And so when it sold to Monsanto, it quickly turned over to Monsanto Genetics. So there was a genetic company not only from Monsanto's seed division, but also the swine division. Of course, since then, that has split off. and kind of tapered off to another company. Swine genetics, just like the seed industry, are extremely critical worldwide. Anytime that we have an opportunity to improve genetics, provide back to the farmer that opportunity of either faster growth, more feed efficiency, anything that makes him more profitable is really that bottom line. So that's exactly what the genetic company, the swine genetic company, was looking at. And that kind of continued to expand beyond that. So it is a part of a variety of different companies that continue to try to help the farmer on a daily basis.
And you're certainly doing that here now, and have been doing it for almost 10 years now here for sorghum. Right prior to that, though, you worked for a swine feeder in the Upper Texas Panhandle, and you mentioned that a second ago, Texas Farm, and that really got you into starting to work with consumers and interface. But there was also good international interactions there too, as they were Japanese owned. So talk a little bit about what you did at Texas Farm, and immediately prior to coming to sorghum, the kind of work that you did, both with consumers and directly with farmers buying grain.
Texas Farm was an interesting organization. When I started with Texas Farm, we really started at the building phase, not only looking at property, trying to work with the just the local area to bring in a new company. So
literally, you came in on the ground and built
it was
buildings.
The ground floor. Predominantly, we were designing buildings. We were working specifically at how those buildings would look, the design overall, trying to build the relationship there locally. So a lot of that had to take place. And of course, at the same time, was trying not only to build the facility, but while at the same time trying to determine how we were going to be moving those animals to market, how we were going to be feeding those animals, looking at a variety of different things that had to take place. So kind of as we started building, of course, that facility continued to grow over time, but there was a whole need for employees as well. So we worked very closely on how do we attract good individuals, how do we maintain those individuals, how do we integrate them also into the local economy and the local environment. The employees as well as the company trying to make sure that we were integrated with the local community so that we would become basically part of that community. That was extremely important, not only for the Japanese that were part of that business, but also for those first individuals that came to work there. Again, as you said, I was one of the first ones that was there. I actually was the first employee to open an office in Perryton, and so quickly started that whole operation. From there, as you point out, of course, there was a lot that was done with the consumer, looking at the consumer, trying to decide specifically on building that relationship. But that came a lot longer into the process. Of course, we had to not only expand the genetics that we had on the facility, but we also had to start production. And basically, when you start looking at building facilities, from that time of building facilities all the way until the time that you have those first animals go to market, it basically was a 2-year run. And so there was a lot of things that had to take place within that time. Of course, you brought up the farmer. We worked very closely. I had a lot of farmer friends, and I still have a lot of farmer friends in Perryton. But a lot of those individuals started to learn exactly how much usage we were going to have, not only of grain, but of other byproducts that would be going into the feed mill. Of course, we built the feed mill there in Perryton, or outside of Perryton, in a smaller town in Farnsworth. And so as we built that, it quickly started to bring in product from the local area as well as from other areas. And so it made that connection of being able not only to see grain from that local area being produced into pork, but it added value specifically into that marketplace. So farmers could rely on a steady need constantly. And that's something that's extremely important for farmers, is to have a need. When we talk about building demand here at the Sorghum Checkoff, it's critical. It's always important to make sure that we have supply, but building demand on the backside becomes much more important.
Absolutely. Sometimes it's you build it and they'll come. In your case, it literally was you build it and they come, because you literally built buildings.
Absolutely.
So many times that's how it is in agriculture. If the flag is up there and there's a market for it, folks will buy. You specifically in your work with farmers, you relied on y'all were really aggressive when it came to contracting, and specifically, y'all had acre contracts with active God clauses, that holy grail of contract for farmers. And it worked. You had more grain coming in than you needed, and you were able to sell some back at times. Talk a little bit about that and what that experience of interacting with farmers with that kind of contract did, and kind of how you think about things now.
One of the things is, as you look at a farmer background and you look at agriculture in general, the swine side is no different. There's a lot of inputs that have to go into that, and it just so happens that feed grains are a big part of that. And so having that opportunity of knowing what our price was, having that opportunity of knowing that we had a fixed supply coming into the feed mill was critical. It really meant the difference between knowing how our cost of production was going to be, absolutely knowing the quality of grain that we were going to have coming into the facility, building on that relationship, that constant relationship that we had with growers there in the local area. We were in a grain deficit area, and so a lot of that grain was being moved into different facilities, whether it was the cattle industry and beyond. And so it really worked very well for us to maintain that close relationship with the farmer, maintain that close relationship with the with not only with the consumer, but beyond that. All of those things integrated together made sure that we were producing a pork product that was easily accepted into the marketplace. So by making sure that we were able to trace that grain back to the local area, making sure that that grain was quality, making sure that it was going to satisfy the needs of our animals was extremely important. So we constantly did that. And, we were able to acquire a lot of grain in that area just by doing that. And it really wasn't a cost for the company. If we knew how to manage that cost coming back, it was fairly easy for us to be able to value that on the backside. By us being able to take it in, store it, being able to manage that crop was a lot easier, instead of totally relying on just the cash market coming into us from other places. Again, we worked very closely with the elevators. We worked with other local trading companies there within the area to supply much more of the grain that we needed as well. But why not work directly with that farmer to be able to benefit both sides? It's great to have that relationship where both of us could capitalize. And that's really what ended up happening, is not only was the farmer able to take advantage of what we were able to offer, but also the company took advantage of what we were able to offer.
So you came to the Checkoff from Texas Farm in 2009, was that correct?
2009.
2009. After having worked with farmers at Texas Farm for
15 years.
For 15 years. So you had really great experience there, working with the farmer side and the consumer side in managing operations and managing people and end uses of sorghum, and it sets you up really well. So you came in 2009. What did you do when you first started working for the Checkoff?
When I first started here, really one of the parts more than anything was looking at the marketing side. So I came in as a marketing director, so it was fully charged at working and trying to build that connection with the consumer at the end. And I say consumer, when we talk about consumer, I think it's important for us to realize every product that we produce on the farm is going to end up at a consumer, whether that consumer is at the local market and then it quickly washes into another marketplace and then quickly becomes a meat product or becomes a food product that's put in a little baggie and we eat it as chips. Whatever that product may be, we are directly influencing the consumer at all levels. And so one of the things that we quickly had to work on when I came to the Checkoff was looking at how does sorghum fit into different marketplaces, not only necessarily the livestock industry. Of course, that was a natural fit. I'd come from the swine industry, and it was important for us to be able to produce items and be able to make markets and be able to share why sorghum would fit into different marketplaces. Of course, sorghum was always one of those crops that was out there that's been grown for many, many years, and it really needed a fit. And we needed to be able to kind of convey what sorghum was to all types of different industries. And that's really what I saw myself doing initially. Of course, one of the things that we quickly talked about was creating a brand. And as you know, that brand continues to exist today, Sorghum the Smart Choice. That brand was defined at that starting point when I first came in, was looking at how do we create a brand that could be used over a period of time and be able to use not only on the farm side, but being able to be used also as we market grain moving forward. Of course, we talk about Sorghum the Smart Choice and how it fits into the farmer. If we look at it from a farmer standpoint, it does have a lot of components that fit well. By saying Sorghum the Smart Choice, we know that it fits at times when maybe rainfall isn't exactly what we expected. It falls very good in a crop rotation type situation. So we start talking about it being a smart choice in a crop rotation. We talk about it being a smart choice as we look at water demand. We look at it as being a smart choice into the feed industry of satisfying the needs of animals. So if you look at it from a nutrient dense type product, it fits well, not only in the swine industry, but also now that we have new developments from the Checkoff into the aquaculture industry, pet food industry, and beyond. As well, it fits very well with that consumer brand as we look at the consumer as looking at it being high in fiber, looking at it being a protein that has a variety of different attributes specifically that could fit into a consumer marketplace.
So talk a little bit about those segments specifically. You named off a half a dozen markets there, and talk about those markets and kind of their shares of the sorghum industry, and kind of how that's changed over time. We certainly have moved to a consumer and high value food market perspective. We've moved to a much higher place now than when you started. So talk about what that looks like now and kind of how that's evolved.
You know, one of the things from a market standpoint is we have to quickly realize that initially our market has always been set aside that it pretty much ran on a third. Our market was a third on the international side. It represented a third into the ethanol industry and a third going into livestock. And that livestock predominantly was the swine industry, looking at the poultry industry to a certain degree, and then also looking at the cattle industry. That, of course, continues to evolve. As we looked at it from China, of course, there's many discussions that could happen from the international side. China, for instance, when it came into the market in 2013, quickly became the leading country as far as imports into that country. And so one of the things that we quickly learned was, how do we make sure that we're managing those markets? How do we make sure that we continue to identify them and continue to nurture and grow them? Of course, China influenced not only the marketplace internationally, but it also influenced some of the other markets that we were targeting at that same time. So if you look at our market last year, it basically was represented about 60% going specifically into the export market, with almost all of that going into China. After that, of course, we start seeing not only the livestock industry, but the ethanol industry. But now all of a sudden, we're starting to see a lot more segmentation into other marketplaces. The pet food industry, for instance, buys a large volume of sorghum that goes into premium dog foods. Oftentimes when we talk about a pet food, everyone wants to make sure that their pets are getting a quality diet, and sorghum fits well into that. And so there's been a lot of studies that the Checkoff has been able to fund to hopefully try to develop that industry even further. You know, I mentioned aquaculture earlier, and aquaculture was one of those things that we feel is an important marketplace internationally. Of course, there's a lot more discussion here domestically of how that might fit in, but the international side is critical.
And aquaculture specifically is catfish.
As we look at
bass.
as we look at the aquaculture, it could range anything from a fish all the way down into shrimp. And so sorghum has been fed into both of those. We look at Pangasius in Vietnam, catfish type animal or a fish, as well as looking at shrimp that was fed here at Texas A&M. So again, you can look at a variety of different areas for it to fit in. That trial that was conducted in Vietnam, we found out very quickly that sorghum fed into that industry extremely well. Not only did it not create a problem from the quality of the fillet or the product itself going into the consumer, but we quickly learned that the efficiency of that fish coming out didn't change. So we felt like being able to utilize sorghum was an easy fit into that industry, and being able to replace other products, whether those products weren't extremely reliable into that marketplace, or whether that product was something that we could produce and hopefully do differently going into that market. Again, as you said, whether it's the aquaculture, another trial that we did also at that same time was ducks. We not only did meat ducks, but we also did laying ducks, and trying to determine how sorghum fit into that market. Again, we quickly realized from the company in China, we quickly realized that sorghum fed extremely well into that industry, and it could be utilized in their diet. So again, as you start looking at some of those industries, there wasn't any information previous to the Checkoff doing that really a company could rely on to say, let's try sorghum. Let's see if sorghum fits into our diet. Let's see if sorghum can really be utilized as a staple crop into our feed ingredients. And lo and behold, now all of a sudden we see that sorghum fits well into that. And so we're starting to create those different market segments where sorghum could be identified as an ingredient that would fit very well into that marketplace.
So I want to back up and talk about how the Checkoff started and kind of history of the program itself. But first, I think this is a really good spot to jump in here and jump ahead 10 or 20 years. You worked with Japanese investors in Texas Farm, and the Japanese, when they do strategic planning, they're thinking 50 years ahead. Most of the people that are involved in those plans won't even be alive when they're making those plans. And that really enabled you, and really made you think ahead a lot. And you really approach that here at the Checkoff. And sometimes you talk about international things, and you talk about food security, and you talk about other countries making strategic investments that will make them more food secure. And that thinking in those terms is really a foreign concept to a lot of people, and especially when you start thinking in those terms like 10, 20, 30 years into the future. So be strategic and visionary and futuristic, and tell us about the international side, and specifically the demand for protein and where we're headed over the next couple of decades in feed grains.
You know, the American farmer is always going to produce. We know that the American farmer, when it's challenged, will continue to rely not only on genetic companies, but continue to rely on their structure. They will continue to rely on technology to continue to produce more. And as we look at a worldwide population by 2050, there's been a lot of assumptions of what that might look like. The most common is to say that there's going to be 9 9 billion people on the earth. And as we look at that, there's going to be a lot more mouths to feed. And so one of the things that I see is, how will sorghum fit into that 20 years down the road? And so we need to make sure that the primary concern of the Sorghum Checkoff is looking downstream at how that farmer is going to be profitable and how he's going to maintain his operation looking forward. He's not only going to rely on sorghum. It would be a mistake for us to think that a farmer is only going to rely on one crop for him to make his future plans on. So we know sorghum's going to be into that rotation, and we see it fitting in extremely well. But we also see other feed grains going into that. But if we look primarily at sorghum and we look at the industry as a whole, one of the things that we can quickly point out is that as the population continues to grow, we're going to need to continue to develop ways that sorghum can be utilized into the feed industry and or into the direct consumer market, whether that is a product that can be taken off the shelf, readily eaten and used as nutrients, or whether that is specifically fed into an animal that will then be harvested later and utilized as a protein source. We need to find those avenues, and I believe that that's really what the Checkoff is striving to do, not only from the consumer side but also from that farmer side. We talked earlier about looking at the American farmer or the U.S. farmer continuing to increase the yields that he might see, continuing to increase the technology that he's going to be utilizing. We at the Checkoff need to continue to look downstream at what is that technology that he's going to need 5 years, 10 years down the road, and how do we help develop that technology that will end up in his field. And as we make investments into the industry, we're making those investments with a hope or with a desire that they will end up in that farmer's field, end with more profit in his pocket, and end in him knowing that he did something that was helping to feed the 9 billion people that are going to be here with us very soon.
Great. So let's go ahead and back up now. So when did the Checkoff start, and what were the goals at the outset? What were some of those early projects and early activities that we were doing here?
You know, one of the things is that as you look at the Sorghum Checkoff when it first started, the one thing that the board, the newest board that started along with NSP's board, there was a vision that was cast. The NSP definitely cast a vision. As they looked at that vision, it was important for them to realize that there wasn't technology that was coming to bear into the sorghum industry. There wasn't those markets that needed to be created. There wasn't as much of a push that needed to exist for sorghum as it moved forward. And so one of the things that quickly became a challenge was, how will we utilize these dollars from the Checkoff or from collections from the Checkoff, from the producer, to really grow that? And so as we looked at technology, as we looked at promotion, as we looked at information, that's really what the desire was from those first initial board members. So if you go back in time, looking at 2008, 2009, when the Checkoff was first started and first developed, although collections took place in that time, really it wasn't until mid-2009 when the board really took shape. The board started specifically looking at, what do we need to do? Initially, of course, it was a free-for-all. The board had many, many different things that they wanted to accomplish. The board really took a wide view and really wanted to change a lot of dynamics. So they kind of threw a large lasso out and kind of saw what they could catch. And so you saw a lot of projects that were being funded by many, many different groups, whether that was both in academia, whether that was in industry, whether that was looking specifically at the consumer side, whether that was looking at the education side. There was just a whole wide loop that was cast trying to find exactly what we could do. And since then, of course, there's been a lot of modifications. There was a initial strategy that was put together. Later on, that initial strategy then created the crop improvement side. It created a renewables division. It created a high-value market segment. You started looking specifically at segmenting areas that could really focus on what is it that we need to do. You actually started to see a board that was so much more receptive on looking at outside help. So they started to rely on people from the outside looking at what will sorghum be? What does sorghum need to be? How can we help the farmer? They started to rely on companies coming to them and working specifically with companies to develop specific products and or specific technology that would roll back to the farm. So again, not only are you seeing that from a market philosophy, but you're also seeing it from a philosophy internally from the Checkoff is evolving into something larger, evolving into something that has a lot more defined program, that has programs that are focused on helping the farmer, that are focused on helping the industry as a whole, helping agriculture as we look at not only the information that's produced, but also leadership, for instance. As we look at the leadership program that was developed by the Checkoff, its intent was to make sure that there was going to be leaders that were going to step into positions not only in the Sorghum Checkoff, but also state boards as we look at those state boards, but also in the ag industry as a whole. We need more leaders that can take that and really let the consumer know what is agriculture, let their neighbors know what is agriculture, what do I do on my farm, and how does it help change the world. That's really what we're trying to convey on a daily basis. And it just so happens that, of course, the Sorghum Checkoff is focused on sorghum. We want the sorghum industry to continue to prosper. We want the sorghum industry to continue to find ways where the farmer can enjoy planting sorghum and reap the benefits of more volume coming from his farm and more profit, while at the same time the consumer reaping the benefits that are produced at a farm level, whether it's going into an animal that will then be harvested or whether it's going directly into a product or sold into a foreign country to help feed those individuals as well. That's really what that focus has been since day one. And of course, that evolution has continued to happen throughout that time.
And at the end of the day, it's the farmer that has to tell these stories, and that's what's great about the Checkoff and the way we're set up. We've got a board of 13 farmers that we can rely on to tell those stories in their own words. We can talk till we're blue in the face, but until a family farmer gets out there and tells that story, it really doesn't matter. You mentioned leadership. We've done a lot to cultivate the next generation of those storytellers and the next generation of those people that can interface with the consumer. Leadership program now it's in its fourth class, and you were instrumental in helping create that. Talk a little bit more about the leadership program and what that has meant from an industry development perspective, and overall how it's helped with consumer interfacing here.
You know, one of the things that you said earlier is the board. And as we look at the Sorghum Checkoff board, of course, there's 13 members that are going on the board constantly. So they're coming on the board and they're falling off the board. And so as those individuals are appointed by the Secretary of Ag, of course, this program still has a very close tie with the Department of Agriculture as well as the Agriculture Marketing Service. Of course, those board members are appointed by the Secretary. And so as new board members come online, we continue to have a pool, or a pool is needed to continue to supply new individuals coming onto the board. And so one of the things that Tim Lust, of course, felt was critical was how do we continue to maintain that pool? How do we continue to develop leaders that are not only focused on becoming board members for the Checkoff, becoming board members for NSP, becoming board members for the Kansas Sorghum Commission, or for Texas, and or for other programs throughout the U.S., but also how do they become leaders, as you said, of creating that voice for agriculture? You know, that was one of that focus points that Tim had originally, is as he looked and stepped back and tried to put this program together, was how do we continue to supply leaders? So that was quickly one of those things that developed over time. So this program, as you said, what does this program really consist of? It's a variety. It's not only focused on how to conduct an interview or how to step into an interview and have a discussion, but it's also focused on marketing. How do you become a stronger marketer? How do you understand the dynamics of what's taking place from an industry? How do you learn more about the seed industry? So a portion of that is very closely tied with learning more about the seed industry and visiting those companies that are here locally, going to Washington, D.C., and actually seeing the functions of the Checkoff and of USDA, and getting a better perspective of how that all comes to bear. You know, it'd be great to be able to see these individuals as they learn more about not only the export market, because they do have an export segment of going to the port and seeing how that grain is moved from the U.S. or from their local elevator all the way into the export market. Hopefully later on they can even see it approaching that export market and going into an animal on the other side. That's really what that goal would be. So continuing to evolve that into something else. But we've seen many, many different individuals come from that program. We've seen those individuals not only serving here on the Checkoff board, but on the NSP board, on the Kansas Commission, on the Texas board, and the Nebraska board. That continues to develop.
And serving as staff for state organizations now.
Absolutely.
In a couple of cases.
So in many cases, those individuals are serving in multiple facets. So it's wonderful to be able to say that a program that was developed with Checkoff dollars is continuing to add value back to the farm. So we see that as being that, hopefully that voice that can take that sorghum message forward with the local community on up into the marketing community and on into these programs, and sharing what their beliefs are on the farm and how their farm is going to make a difference worldwide as we look at it into the future.
So you mentioned going to the port and actually seeing the port facility, and it seems like everything points back to trade these days. There's quite a bit going on in trade, and we have certainly kept the leadership class really involved in the trade discussions, and we've kept them in the know on how that works and how that impacts your bottom line. And certainly we started out this morning talking about trade. We have a ton of trade related events coming up. We've got teams coming. We got export exchange. We've got a lot that we're doing here that is directly tied into trade for very obvious reasons. So talk a little bit about what we have coming up on the export side.
You know, on the export side, as we talked earlier, of course, the export side is still a very large segment of the sorghum marketplace. And it still has a lot to do with the price. As you look at the price currently today, you and I, of course, continue to review that on a constant basis. But if you look at those port values as they are put out by Market Perspectives and the U.S. Grains Council, the port value still remains over the price of corn. And so it's one of those things that we quickly point out, that we have a 3 to 7% value appreciation over the price of corn on the export market, even though today we're not exporting grain. So again, by being able to hold that value at the port, we still know that there definitely seems to be a lot of encouragement that the export industry or the export marketplace will come back, and it will see large shares of sorghum moving into other countries. So it's important that we remain engaged. The last thing we want to do is step away from that and take our money and move it somewhere else. Of course, the international market is extremely important, but we put a lot of emphasis here domestically. But as we talk about the international segment, of course, we've worked very closely with the U.S. Grains Council. It's something that has been done over a period of time, not only as the checkoff has existed, but even previous to the checkoff existing. A lot of the organizations were providing funds into the U.S. Grains Council, making sure that there was an opportunity to use dollars that would help increase the marketplace for sorghum. You know, today, as we look at the international side, you talked earlier about the export exchange. There's a lot of different countries that will come together from the into the export exchange. That is a program that's put together by the U.S. Grains Council. It's going to be happening in Minneapolis this year. There'll be individuals from all over the world that will be joining there.
How many folks usually attend that event?
Yeah, typically it's about 200 internationally, and they come from a variety of different countries. And so as we look at different countries, you see not only the Asian countries, but you see some from Europe, you see a lot from Africa, you start seeing a lot of countries from South and Central America, looking specifically into what the council is doing, what the corn industry, the sorghum industry, the barley industry are doing, and learning a little bit more about those segments and trying to identify ways of purchasing sorghum, corn, and also barley. So we work closely with them to try to make sure that we're providing them with the resources that they need, not only to learn more about sorghum and how to utilize it in their marketplace, but also creating that direct link back to the farmer. You know, oftentimes when we have individuals come from a foreign country, we have those individuals come from China, and they've been able to go and sit at a coffee table with a local farmer and sit down and really share with them. The farmer has that opportunity to share what he's doing on a constant basis and what he's doing to provide that international consumer, that international marketplace with the grain. He's trying to educate those buyers on what he does from a soil conservation side, what he does from water conservation, what he does from technology, how he produces his grain, how that grain is harvested, how that grain flows from his farm into the local elevator, and then into a regional elevator, and then from that regional elevator into an export elevator, and from that export elevator onto a ship, and finally making it to the other side, or making it to that end user. You know, that end user doesn't get to see all of those supply chains, and sometimes he only gets to see the end product. He doesn't get to put a face with that end product. By putting a face with it, he starts to quickly realize this guy's no different than I am. This is a farmer that is trying to provide for his family. This is a farmer that's trying to provide for the world. This is a farmer that's trying to do the best that he can to make sure that he's conserving his resources to continue to grow into the future. You know, there's nothing more important than that link of trying to connect a face with it at the end point. Of course, when it all comes down is that end user's also looking for a price, and he needs to quickly realize that that price is affected by many different parts of the segment. But of course, he can kind of connect that face with the farmer, and they can see each other in a different light. They can start applying about their basic philosophies and utilizing those to hopefully move the market forward. Of course, those end users are always looking to the merchandisers, are always looking to the larger industry, because they have many mouths to feed. And so they can't always just look at that one individual farmer. They're going to target a variety. So that's why we put not only a lot of emphasis of taking that person that's coming from export exchange on those trade missions, putting them together with that local farmer, but also putting them together with that elevator, putting them together with that person that's going to be supplying them with hopefully a bid that they will be able to acquire that grain and then in turn have it come to their country. So as you can see, there's many different segments that come together, and there needs to be a voice at each one of those. And it just so happens that the Checkoff is trying to be that voice for the sorghum industry. And I believe that as we continue to move forward, we're continuing to do a better job at being that voice, being that mechanism that can connect that buyer, that seller together, being that mechanism that can connect that consumer back to the farmer, being that mechanism that can connect the technology provider, that provider that's creating genetics, being able to connect him directly with the farmer, that voice from the farmer being able to step up and say, this is what I need on my farm. This is the technology that I need today. This is what I need that will help me grow more sorghum, help me conserve the resources that are on my farm, help me be a farmer into the coming years as we see that. That's the tool that we're trying to provide on a daily basis.
Okay, so that's that is an incredible role for us, and I think we do it extremely well. Connecting buyers and sellers is exceedingly important, and if there's nowhere to go with that grain, it just really doesn't matter if you're growing it. But that's really only half the story. The other half is ultimately that farmer accepting that offer, or taking that position on the board, or taking that next step to go ahead and lock that deal down. And another area that we haven't really talked about a whole lot here, and it ties into what we're doing here, sitting talking on a podcast, is actually the marketing tools that the producer has available to take advantage of these outlets for grain. And that was really the genesis of this podcast, is talking about how we give farmers the tools that they need to take advantage of those markets that we're trying to create for them, whether it's international or ethanol or whatever. So talk a little bit about specifically your vision in starting this, or suggesting that we start this podcast, and how that goes into our strategic plan, and how this will help the farmer be successful long term.
You know, information is critical. And that's been an evolution overall. It used to be that even in the swine industry, as we step back and we look at the swine industry, it was pretty common. It was a common practice. It was a common practice as we look back, even from my standpoint, it was a common practice to just know what the price was and take your animals to market, and whatever the price was that day, that's what we accepted. It was common. It continues to be pretty much a common philosophy. Is when I produce it, I take it into the marketplace, and what they're willing to offer me is what I'm taking today. Well, that's not necessarily the case anymore. There's so much information that not only the farmer is being bombarded with, but the consumer as well. So as we look at that information, there's a lot of resources that are going on. It used to be, and we can all look back and we can remember that there was a screen that everyone used to look at. And that screen was one of the first things that we did, was we tried to get one of those screens at our operation so that we could look at the prices that were going on a daily basis. Not only that, but we could look at the weather real time. So it was one of the interesting parts, was being able to really capture that device and being able to bring it and have it at your office or at the farm, looking at what the price was doing on a 15-minute interval, and looking what the weather was doing on a 15-minute interval. That was really cool. Well, we're way beyond that now. We're actually beyond that, where not only are we looking at what the CME is doing or what the board price is doing, we're also looking at what are the worldwide funds doing, what is the stock market doing, what is weather internationally doing, what is the weather in Brazil, and how is it going to impact their crop? How's that going to change the market price for tomorrow? How's that price going to be influenced by what's happening in a foreign country from a foreign from a foreign disease. So if we look at disease and how it's impacting the swine industry in China, what are their needs going to be, not only from a protein source, looking at soybeans, but also looking at grain sources? All of that is now directly impacting that price. And so all of a sudden we look at, yes, we used to be able to look at what was taking place at our local elevator, and we took it in and we got that cash price, and we were happy because we got a cash price, and that cash price was whatever was the going marketplace, and either plus or minus the basis. And then we really didn't worry about it. We didn't worry about where it was going, what it was doing. And so it was nothing more than us supplying the grain into the market and us receiving the price and being able to capture the price on a cash market. As that has continued to evolve, kind of like what I just said, was being able not only to recognize what was happening internationally, but looking at what are those demand points. Are we influencing demand internationally? Are we transitioning other markets to utilize sorghum? Are we transitioning marketplaces like the ethanol industry to make sure that they're capturing as much value from sorghum as possible? Then now all of a sudden is the farmer is much more readily available to be able to say, what's my local cash price? What's my cash price at an elevator? What's my cash price at a pork facility? What is my cash price or my future price on the board? How might I lock that in? How can I work with a company that maybe provides me with the marketing expertise to maybe lock in that price, or maybe hedge my futures, or looking at contracts to deliver, looking at a whole different mechanism as we price our commodities moving forward. So one of the things that I would quickly say is, as we're evolving on the farm, so too does the price. We evolve because technology is providing us a lot more on the farm. Not only are we looking at auto steer, not only are we looking at no-till practices, not only are we looking at practices beyond those today, we're looking at whether we're utilizing drones to survey our crop. Not only are we looking at drones, but now all of a sudden we're talking about sensors and utilizing sensors throughout the farm. We're using that technology on farm. Why aren't we using that technology when we market? Of course, I'm also saying that there's a lot of farmers that are currently using those technologies. That's awesome. How do we continue to educate more farmers to utilize those same resources to move that market forward beyond where we are today? So it's an evolution. You know, that evolution needs to continue to happen. We're going to continue to find new technology on the farm. And as we find that new technology, and as we produce more, and as you have more supply, we also need to make sure that we're transitioning and making sure that we're selling it for the best price possible. So why not use the technology that's available today to be able to capture the best price possible? So I would not only want or encourage us to be able to utilize the best technology on the farm, but I want to utilize the best technology to get the best price possible. And then I also want us to be able to utilize the best technology to create demand worldwide. If we're able to do all of that today, the U.S. American farmer will continue to be the most profitable individual that can be created, or that we can create, or that he can take use of. So those are the things that I feel are extremely valuable, is how do we continue to utilize those resources so that we are the marketplace for grain. The U.S. is and will be the marketplace. So how do we continue to encourage the farmer not only to use that technology, but also use the technology on the marketing side as well?
So that's a great segue into a wrap up here. Let's fast forward 10 years or 15 or 5 or whatever. The Checkoff board is undergoing a strategic planning process right now, and we've talked a lot about putting a goal on what we're doing. So we're going to yield 100 bushels by 2035 or whatever on average. So talk about where we're headed as a checkoff and as an industry over the next, pick your number of years.
As you look at the industry, and a lot of individuals will talk 2050 or 2025 or 2030. I guess that first transition is 2030, as the number is supposed to reach 8 billion people on Earth. And that first transition, of course, there's going to be more need. And you see an evolution of technology taking place. There's already been a lot of different technology that is in the pipeline that the Checkoff is hopefully working with industry to try to create, whether that is technology that will help him from a grass and a weed problem, or whether that technology is directly looking at something like the sugarcane aphid. How are we going to influence that over a period of time? On into the market segment is, how do we continue to find more products that'll fit into sorghum? So as we look at that first transition, you were talking about yield. What I'd like to see is yield continue to increase. There's been a lull in sorghum yields, and a lot of that lull here recently, of course, we've seen a nice transition. We've seen an increase on the average yield. We'd like to continue to see that. That lull doesn't need to exist. We feel that lull is there because the technology that comes to bear, also the quality of ground that sorghum is being placed on, management, there's a lot of those aspects that are there that can be quickly challenged. We believe that the Checkoff is providing tools for the farmer from a management perspective, also from a technology perspective, that'll hopefully help continue to build that yield up. Of course, as we talked, that yield right now, looking into that 70s category, you'd really like to see that. I personally would like to see that hopefully hit 100. I believe it can. We need to also realize and understand that the technology that's out there today, the seed that you're planting today, has the genetic potential for a lot more than what it's showing today. A lot of what we need to do is find ways to continue to provide small technology growth, provide items that will curb the weed pressure, curb the grass pressure, curb the insect pressure, curb those items that, if we're able to do that, will continue to build on that yield basis as we move forward. So definitely, I'd like to see yields go up. I feel that yields are one of those areas that need to continue to increase. Hitting 100 definitely would provide a lot more opportunity for the farmer to hopefully continue and remain profitable as he looks for the marketplace. From a market standpoint, we always talk about sorghum, and one of the things that I always point out on sorghum is 95% of all the sorghum is traded at harvest. Only 5% is ever held by the farmer and sold later, or sold directly into an industry. Almost all of it is transitioned quickly into the cash market background. As we look into that cash market, I think that the farmer oftentimes has an opportunity to leave some money on the table. I believe that as we look at all farming enterprises, whether it's looking at sorghum, whether it's looking at corn, whether that's looking at soybeans, you're going to continue to see an evolution on marketing. Marketing is going to be continue to focus on how that farmer is going to maintain some of his stored grain, how he's going to sell it into the marketplace, how he might look at his product being valued differently than another farmer, another segment. He's going to be looking at traceability. He's going to be looking at a farmer's going to be looking at that from a traceability standpoint. They're going to be looking at it from a higher value. How is my soybean that is bushel weight, a little bit better bushel weight, whether it's a little bit better protein, how do I have it segmented off to where I can sell it directly into an end user and reap some of those benefits back onto the market, back onto my farm directly? So I believe that you're going to start seeing that transition, that farmer is going to kind of evolve into more of a marketing expert. You know, we talk about the farmer being only a farmer. A farmer is way beyond a farmer. You know, we're not looking at a farmer as just planting my crop and being able to see it mature, being able to look at it and being able to harvest it and then taking it to the elevator and forgetting about it. It's no longer that.
Let's be honest, a farmer is a CEO.
A farmer definitely is a CEO. He has employees. He has land. He has debt that he's trying to pay off. He has a family that he's trying to support. He has enterprises that he's trying to support. He has a variety of different items that he's looking at on a constant basis, and he's trying to figure out how best am I going to do that. And now he's looking at a marketing perspective of, for me to get a better market price, I need to take an active role in my marketing. To take an active role in my marketing, I need to learn as much as I possibly can. I need to utilize the resources that are available to me, whether that's going into a podcast and learning more about marketing, or whether that is directly going to a presentation put on by the Grains Council or a presentation put on by the National Corn Growers or by NSP or by the Sorghum Checkoff, that he can go and learn what is taking place in the market, what is taking place, what are the new dynamics, what should I be looking downstream, what do I need to look at next year that is going to affect my price? How am I going to look at weather in South America? How am I going to look at weather in Australia as they go through a massive drought? How will that impact my price? And is there something that I can do today that will put me in a better position tomorrow to reap the benefits of the marketplace moving forward? That's what I see as being the key into that CEO, as you put it, as we look at that CEO developing on the farm. How do I utilize the resources that will help me achieve the goals that I have set aside for my farm?
Man, I couldn't have scripted a better synopsis for Sorghum Smart Talk podcast. That was excellent and great way to wrap up. Thanks for making time for us this morning, Florentino.
Appreciate it as always, John.
And thank you for joining us on Sorghum Smart Talk. Join us again next time. In the meantime, check us out on a growing list of platforms. Google Play Music, SoundCloud, Spotify, iTunes, Libsyn, Stitcher. Check us out on sorghumgrowers.com, sorghumcheckoff.com. Follow us on Instagram, Twitter, like us on Facebook. Thanks for joining us.